Hello, I'm Dr. McFadden, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and I am extremely happy to have this opportunity to present to you Module number 3, Human Communication and Enthusiastic Consent. Today's session, however, is going to be devoted to human communication. We're going to spend some time looking at what we call communication truths. And why do we include human communication as an individual module in the Wildcats Foundation's course? Is because communication is extremely important. One of the things that I hope to do in this session is to share with you just how important communication is. Effective communication. Now, we all communicate, but we don't all communicate effectively. And so there's a lot of things to know and a lot of things to understand so that we can be better communicators in terms of sending messages and better communicators in terms of receiving messages. So we'll start with the very first communication truth. The first one is that communication is a multi-level process. And of course, multi means many or several. We're saying that communication is a multi-level process, and the word process is important to understand because we can define process as a series of steps or stages that lead to a final product or outcome. So we're saying that communication is a multi-level process. Then the question then that is before us is, what are those levels? And you might be thinking of what those levels are. But one of the first levels, of course, is what I'm doing. So it's verbal communication. But obviously that's not the only form of communication because we've already said it's a multi-level process. So not only is there verbal communication, but there's also nonverbal communication. So that's the communication, of course, without words. And the truth is that most of our communication really is nonverbal. And so many things that we do, and we might not assign meaning to it, but other people will try to make sense out of what they see in the absence of words. The third level of communication is called para-language, P-A-R-A language. And para-language is not what is said, it is how something is said. And there's a lot of information in how we say things. So if I were to say, shut the door, you would get a meaning from that. But if I said, shut the door, you get another meaning from that. So in the second way in which I said shut the door, that implies some urgency, that something is going on that requires that we close the door. And so the way we say something has a great deal of information in it, not only the words, but how those words are actually said. So when we say that communication is a multi-level process, there are a variety of questions that we should include in just looking and thinking about that. One of those questions is, what are the benefits of understanding that communication is a multi-level process? And there are lots of benefits. Because once you understand that it's more than what you say, but it's also what you don't say, because sometimes that says more than what you say, and sometimes it's how you say what you say, then you also understand that it is a mistake to only listen to words. You have to have a 360-degree approach to human communication. And so when you're engaged with someone, talking with another person, you're not just listening to words. That's a mistake. But you're also watching all the nonverbals. You're watching how the person is standing. You're watching whether or not the person is making eye contact with you, actually looking at you. But you're also listening to how something is said, because there's information in each of those levels of communication. Another question that we might ask ourselves is, how does this knowledge relate to my interactions with other people? And those people might be fellow classmates, it could be faculty, it might be staff members, and just in general, people that you come in contact with. It makes all the difference in the world if you understand that when you're communicating with another human being, you cannot decide that it's okay only to listen to the words. You're missing much too much information if that's the decision that you make. You have to listen to what isn't being said, but also listen to what is being said and how it's being said. So that's the first communication truth we want to talk about today. But the second communication truth is you cannot not communicate. Now, how is that possible? I know you might enter a classroom and decide to take a seat in the back. You might decide, I'm not going to say anything today. I'm just going to sit here. I'm going to take notes. And when the class period is over, I'm leaving. But guess what? You have still communicated. You don't have to say anything. And what happens is people will try to make sense out of your not saying anything. People will try to make sense out of you deciding to sit in the back. Your professors will make sense out of you sitting on the first row of a class, because they will try, and it's not just professors, but people will try to assign or make sense out of what they see. And so when we say that you cannot not communicate, we are saying that there are, in that terms of the nonverbal, there's lots of information. So let's suppose you are the first person to arrive to class. Every class period, when the professor walks in, you're always there. You're the first one. What might the professor think that means? Well, the professor could think it means a lot of things. One possibility is that you catch a ride to class and the person drops you off early, so that means you're always early. It might also mean that you really want to sit wherever you like to sit, and of course students have favorite seats. So many times they sit in the same seat every class periods. It might be interpreted to mean that you are really into that subject, into that course. And so you are communicating that without saying to the professor, I really like this class. That's why I'm always early, and that's why I sit up front. Does our use of time communicate something? It does, absolutely. Time is nonverbal. But when you arrived, it is said that Malcolm X was never late. That if he said he would be at your house at 8:30, your doorbell would ring at 8:30. And so how we use time communicates something. It communicates that whatever is going on is important to us. It communicates respect for the people who are involved in and in that place and in that space at that time. And if we are consistently late for everything, that communicates something too. So what we want to be mindful and want you to think about is and understand is that there's information and meaning that people will assign to how you use time. Other types of nonverbal communication, of course, include things like environment. We're in a classroom setting. You're in a classroom setting. And so there are lots of things that create this setting. So we've got walls. We've got the colors that are on walls, because there's a lot of research and information that talks about how people respond to different colors. So some colors are thought to really make people feel anxious or nervous or excite people. We've all heard about how people respond to red cars, for example. But there are also lights in this room. There's fluorescent or artificial lighting, but there's also natural light coming from the window or windows. And so the observation we would make is that people do respond differently to environments where there is a lot of light and environments where there is not a lot of light. These seats are in rows. That communicates something, or it facilitates communication or not. And so a part of what we want you to understand, especially as you move forward and start doing things in groups or in organizations, is that you can make very conscious decisions about things. You can decide to hold an event in a place because it's very brightly lit. You can decide to hold an event in a place because it has desks or tables that are very easy to move. because depending upon how the room is set up, it will either facilitate easy communication or it will make communication problematic or more difficult. And so this is a room that has desks. So what happens oftentimes in a classroom is that the teacher will say, get in a circle, and so you end up moving the desks so you can face each other. And so there's information, lots of information, that goes along with not saying a single word. And we want you really to be mindful and think about those things. The third communication truth that I want to talk about with you today is that, and it's, for me, it's one of the most important communication truths that you will ever learn. It is that meanings are in people and not in words. That is so very important. And what that really means is that you can say something to a person and think they understand it exactly the way you meant them to understand it, but their response tells you that they did not understand it the way you meant for them to understand it. And so then we don't get offended. We just kind of step back and we say, how did that happen? It happened because meanings are not in the words. They are in the person. And they are connected to the way in which we were raised. They are connected to our meanings, are connected to the experiences that we've had. The opportunities to travel and see other parts of the country or the world. All of these things impact how we see things and how we interpret things. So if I were to say something like, it's going to be hot tomorrow in Daytona Beach, well, the word hot can mean different things for different people. So if I'm from Miami, then hot might mean it's going to be at least 98. If I'm from Ohio, or if I'm from Michigan, or if I'm from Maine, hot might be 70 degrees. So meanings are not in the words, meanings are in the people. And that is really so important to understand. Because as we really try to communicate and have healthy exchanges with other people, be they the person sitting next to you or your roommate or professor, it's just really important to understand that we want to strive for clarity and we want to strive to give as much information as we can give and not necessarily assume. The problem would be in making assumptions. So one of the things that we do when we are communicating is we do a kind of an internal check. And so sometimes we will say something and then we'll add, for example, or if we're checking to make sure we understand what we've heard, we might ask the person, do you mean, when you say that, do you mean? And then that gives the person who has said whatever they've said an opportunity to clarify it so that you end up really understanding what the person has said. That's just really important because human communication is important. We have an opportunity to initiate first relationships, and then build those relationships. But it's very difficult to do that if we think we understand something that we just didn't understand. If we take something the wrong way. And it's not really the wrong way, it's the way we've taken it based on those things like experiences and past situations. And so it's not as though it's a deliberate negative response to something. It's just that we need more information. And so we shouldn't be afraid to get clarity so that we can respond appropriately. So meanings are in people and not in words. If I were going to ask you to write down a couple of things, I would ask you to write down, for example, if you graduate and you could live in any city in the world or in the States, because it is the best place to live, I guarantee there would be lots of different answers. Some people would say Atlanta, some people would say Miami, some people would say Houston, but there would be lots of different responses. And then you can have a conversation about why people selected those particular cities. The next communication truth that we will talk about today is something that comes from someone named Marshall McLuhan. in 1969, a long time ago. But McLuhan wrote a book called The Medium is the Message. And that's really, really important to understand. So we can understand the word medium to be the channel. It is the way information moves from you to someone else. And so the medium, and we have lots of choices, and that's key, because what I would like you to understand is that you want to think about the choice that you use to move that message from yourself to someone else. So when we say we have choices, and there are several mediums, we can decide on a verbal medium or a nonverbal medium. We can decide that we want to make a phone call. We can decide that we want to show up and knock on someone's door. We can decide that we want to write a letter. We can decide that we want to send an email. We can decide that we want to send a text message. And so all of those are different ways to communicate. And what we want you to understand is that you want to be conscious and thoughtful in terms of the medium that you decide to use. Because every medium or every particular choice is not for everybody. And so while your friends are perfectly comfortable with you sending them a text, your professor may not be. Or while your friend is especially comfortable with you scribbling a note and sliding it under the door of his or her room, that might not be the way to communicate with your professor. And so another very important factor to consider when you choose the medium, when you decide if you're going to make a phone call, or you're going to send a text, or if you're going to show up in person and knock on a door or send an email, is to think about what? Think about who the message is for. But also think about what the message is about. Because depending upon what the message is about, you might decide to select a different medium. So let's suppose that you've missed a really important test. What do you think the best way to communicate to the professor is? Would you write a note and slide it under his or her office door and you keep going? Probably not. Probably not. And sometimes you would use more than one medium. So in a situation like that, maybe the best thing to do is to send an email. Dear Professor McFadden, I know I missed the test. I would love to come. I would like very much to come and talk with you about the reasons. I will call you during your office hours. So those are two mediums, right? An email followed by a phone call. Or maybe an email followed by, that includes, I'm going to come by and see you during your office hours. And so, again, we're talking about making very conscious and deliberate choices in terms of our human communication in order to what? Get the kinds of results that we want. And so if we're cavalier, we just we don't really think about it, we don't think it's really serious, then sometimes we can't get the results that we really want to get. And so one of the things that we then want you to think about is when you interact with each other, when you interact with the person sitting to your left or the person sitting to your right, when you interact with your professors, when you interact with your roommate, when you interact with anybody on campus or off campus, just know that most people take human communication for granted. There are just too many things to consider. There are too many things that could go wrong. They don't have to go wrong. And we believe that with the information you've been given so far as it relates to human comm, you'll be much more effective as a communicator. So today, what we've covered 4 communication truths. We started out with communication being a multi-level process, and you understand that better. And then we went on to you cannot not communicate. You understand that better. And then thirdly, we looked at meanings being in people and not in those words. And finally, we said that the medium is the message. that concludes the information that we want to share with you on human communication. Thank you.